Those animals are a nuisance to this community, and you will remove them by Friday, or we will start charging you $50 a head every single day until they are gone." That was Brenda Voss, president of the Cottonwood Ridge Homeowners Association, standing at the end of my gravel drive in white sneakers that had never touched dirt, reading off a clipboard like she was reading a verdict. The animals she meant were my 2-quarter horses, Dusty and a mare named June, standing in a pasture my family had fenced before her subdivision existed. What Brenda did not know, what she never once bothered to check in the 11 months she spent ticketing me, was that the pretty white stable on the far side of the ridge, the one her HOA rented every spring for its galas and its fundraisers and her own daughter's wedding, sat on a parcel I could buy out from under her any day I chose. If a woman handed you a $50 a day fine for animals that were grazing land your grandfather cleared, what would you have done? My name is Ray Calhoun. I was 61 that year, a retired large animal veterinarian, 34 years in practice across 3 counties, and I owned 11 acres at the dead end of Saddle Creek Road. The land came to me from my grandfather, who ran cattle on it when this whole valley was nothing but pasture and dry creek beds. My wife, Carol, and I raised our daughter on that land. Carol passed 4 years before Brenda ever showed up, and after the funeral, did the only thing that kept my hands from shaking. I kept records. Every bill, every vaccination log, every fence repair, every letter. I had a gray filing cabinet in the mudroom, and a habit older than my marriage of writing down what happened the day it happened. That habit is the only reason I can tell you this story the way it ended. My granddaughter Hannah lived with me by then. She was 15, sharp as a barbed wire fence, and she had come to stay after her mother. My daughter took a traveling nursing contract 2 states over to pay down what nursing school had cost her. Hannah loved those horses more than she loved most people. She got up before her alarm to feed them, and she could read a horse's mood from across a field the way some kids read a phone. She was the one who first noticed the surveyor's stakes appear in the field east of our line, little wooden flags with orange tape that snapped in the wind. She came in at supper and asked me what they were. I told her somebody was measuring something that was not ours to measure. That was the spring the developer broke ground on Cottonwood Ridge. And that was the beginning. The houses went up fast. Big tan things with 3-car garages and lawns that needed more water than the creek could spare. I watched the framing crews work through May and June, watched the model home go up with its little flags and its banner promising a lifestyle, and I did not think much of it beyond the dust. Land changes hands. My grandfather had built 2. With his own hands, a barn and a well and a fence line. I had mended 100 times. I figured the new people would settle in, learn the valley, and we would all leave each other alone. I was wrong about that, but not about the deed. And in the end, the deed was the only thing that mattered. The HOA formed before the last roof was on. They held their first meeting in the model home's garage, folding chairs and a card table, and Brenda Voss got herself elected president the way some people get elected to things, by being the only one loud enough to want it. I heard about it secondhand from the man who delivered my hay, who had a cousin in the subdivision. He said the new president had stood up and talked for 40 minutes about community standards and property values and the importance of a unified aesthetic, and that nobody else had wanted the job badly enough to argue. Her husband, Gerald, ran a small commercial real estate outfit 2 towns over, the kind that optioned land and flipped entitlements and made its money in the gap between what a parcel was and what it could be permitted to become. I did not know that part yet. I only knew that one Tuesday in April, a letter showed up in my box, on letterhead, with a little logo of a stylized ridgeline. informing me that my property was now within the Cottonwood Ridge community boundary and subject to its covenants. It was not. My 11 acres predated the subdivision by 90 years. My grandfather's deed, recorded at the county in 1931, described the parcel by metes and bounds that had nothing to do with any plat Brenda's developer ever filed. The language in it still named the old survey monuments, an iron pin at the creek bend, a notched cottonwood that had long since fallen, and a line run so many chains and links from a section corner that the county surveyors had walked themselves in my practice years. But I am a polite man, and I drove over to the clubhouse that week to tell her so, in person, with a copy of my deed in a manila folder under my arm. The clubhouse smelled of fresh paint and carpet glue. Brenda sat behind a desk that was too big for the room, a laptop open in front of her, and a stack of citation forms squared at the corner. She did not look at the folder. She told me the community had standards, that livestock did not fit the aesthetic the homeowners had paid for, and that she was confident we could find a compliance pathway together. I set the folder on the desk and opened it to the deed. I told her my horses had stood on that ground longer than her road had a name, that the parcel was recorded in 1931, that she was welcome to read it. She did not lower her eyes to the page. She smiled the way you smile at a child who has said something almost clever. Mr. Calhoun, this parcel is functionally part of our jurisdiction now, whatever some old paper says. She slid the folder back across the desk toward me with one finger. Then she wished me a blessed afternoon and went back to her spreadsheet. I went home and wrote it down. April 14th. First contact. I underlined the word functionally because something about the way she said it told me she had decided the truth before she ever checked it. A person who will not look at the deed in front of her is a person who has already chosen not to know. I had spent 34 years watching owners refuse to hear a diagnosis they did not want, and I knew the look. Brenda had it. And the thing about that look is that it does not stop. It escalates, because the only thing worse than being wrong is being shown. The first fine came in May. $50 for keeping livestock in violation of the Community Animal Ordinance. It arrived in a windowed envelope with a return by date and a little box where I was meant to admit the violation. I did not pay it. I photographed the notice on the kitchen table next to that morning's newspaper, so the date was in the frame, logged it and filed it in a folder I labeled Cottonwood in black marker. Hannah watched me do it. She asked me if we were in trouble. I told her no, that we were building something, and that one day she would understand what. She did not press. She just started taking photographs of the stakes and the notices on her phone, saving them to a folder of her own, time-stamped automatically, because she was my granddaughter and the habit was in the blood. I did not ask her to. She simply began the way she had begun feeding the horses before her alarm. Because a thing that needs doing gets done in our family, without a speech about it. The second fine came 2 weeks later. Same envelope, same $50, a new citation number. Then a third. By the end of June, the HOA had issued 6 citations against me, each one for $50. I lined them up in the folder, in order, and the numbers on them did not even run sequential, which told me Brenda was citing other people too, that I was one of several. She had decided did not fit the aesthetic. Brenda began driving past my property in a white SUV with a vanity plate that read RIDGON, slowing at my gate, sometimes stopping to photograph my horses through the open window as if they were evidence of a crime. Dusty would lift his head and look at her, and June would not even bother. I waved at her every time. A slow, easy wave, the kind you give a neighbor. It seemed to bother her more than anything else I could have done. Once she rolled the window down as if to say something, thought better of it, and drove on. I wrote that down too. Some of the best evidence is the thing a person almost says. In July, she escalated. A man in a polo shirt showed up at my fence line on a Wednesday morning with a clipboard and a laminated badge that said Code Compliance Officer. Except the county code office is in a brick building on 3rd Street I had visited 100 times across my career, and I knew every inspector they employed by their first names, and this man was not one of them. He had soft hands and new boots, and he stood with the particular stiffness of a person performing a job, rather than doing one. He told me he was conducting an inspection of my containment structures on behalf of the community. I walked over to the fence, took my time about it, and asked him whose authority he carried. He said the association's. I asked to see the county work order. He did not have one. I told him the association had no authority over my land, that the county had not sent him, and that he was standing on private property without permission and needed to leave. He looked at the badge on his own chest as if it might argue for him. Then he left. I wrote it down, July 9th. Fake, inspector, polo shirt, soft hands. Badge ordered off the internet, near as I could tell, because the county seal printed on it was last year's design, the one they had retired when they redid the courthouse letterhead. That was the first time I let myself feel something other than patience. My jaw set, and my hands found the top rail of the fence and held it. A man with a fake badge walking my fence line is not a fine. It is a person willing to pretend that authority does not have, and a person willing to do that is a person who has stopped believing the rules apply to the side he is on. I stood at the fence a long while after he drove off, watching the dust settle on the road. And then I went inside and called the sheriff's office, and a deputy named Owen Tate came out the next morning to take the report. Owen was a steady man, maybe 40, who had grown up 2 valleys over and knew the difference between a property line and an opinion. He took his hat off at the gate, which I noticed, and he did not step onto the grass until I waved him through, which I noticed more. He looked at my deed, holding it carefully by the edges, looked at the badge photo Hannah had captured through the kitchen window, and told me something I have repeated to 100 people since. He said a complaint once filed has to be acted on, regardless of whether it has merit, because that is how the system protects everyone equally, the guilty and the innocent both. He said it was the worst part of the job, and the most necessary. But he also said that a pattern of harassment, properly documented, builds its own case, that a stack of dated records is worth more in the end than any amount of being right, and that if I kept doing exactly what I was doing, writing it all down, I would have something no clipboard could argue with. He told me to log every contact, save every notice, photograph everything with the date in frame, and never once raise my voice, because the moment I raised my voice, I would hand them the only weapon they did not already have. I told him I had been doing all of that since May. He looked at the folder again, at the neat dated pages, and he almost smiled, and said it looked like I had the better part of a year's head start. By August, the HOA had filed 11 citations. Brenda's lawyer, a man named Phil Renner, who did most of his work for the developer, and kept an office above the title company in town, sent me a letter threatening a lien on my property for the accumulated fines, which by then totaled $550 on paper money. A lien on a deed recorded in 1931 by an association formed the year before last. I read the letter twice at the kitchen table. The legal language was thick and confident. full of shall and pursuant and hereby, the kind of language meant to make a man's stomach drop. Mine did not drop. I had read enough of Renner's kind of letter, across a long career, to know that confidence on letterhead is the cheapest thing in the world. I filed it in the cottonwood folder behind the citations and kept grazing my horses on my grandfather's ground. Owen Tate came by once that month, off the clock, in his own truck, and I gave him a cup of coffee on the back step. He looked over the folder, the citations lined up in order, the photographs date-stamped, the fake inspector's badge captured clean through the kitchen window. He turned the pages slowly. When he finished, he set the folder on his knee and said it was the most complete record of harassment he had seen come across his desk, and that whatever I was waiting for, I was nearly there. I did not tell him what I was waiting for. I only said that I had learned a long time ago that you treat the disease, not the symptom, and that I had finally found where this one lived. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded the way a man nods when he decides to trust you, and finished his coffee, and went home. Then the real shape of it started to show. Hannah came in one evening from the feed store with a flyer. She had pulled off the community board by the register. The Cottonwood Ridge Spring Gala, it said. Hosted at the historic Ridgeview Stable Tickets. $100. Proceeds to the Association Beautification Fund. There was a photo of a long white barn with a cupola and a weather vane shaped like a running horse, set against the pines on the western slope. I knew that barn. Every horseman in the valley knew that barn. It had been built by a family named Pierce in the 1950s, board by board, with timber milled off the slope behind it, and it had passed through a few hands since, and for the last decade it had been owned by an old client of mine. Hannah set the flyer on the table between us and tapped the weather vane with one finger. "That's the prettiest barn in the county," she said, "and they're charging $100 to stand in it." I looked at that running horse weather vane a long time. His name was Walt Hendry. I had treated his horses for 20 years before he sold off his string and got too old to ride. And I had set his stallion's broken cannon bone in a January snowstorm once, the two of us working by truck headlights until 2 in the morning, and the horse had walked sound for 9 more years because of it. Walt never forgot it. He owned the Ridgeview parcel free and clear, 40 acres with the stable on it, and he leased the stable out for events. Because it brought in a little money, and he liked seeing the place used rather than standing empty. He had no children. He had told me more than once, leaning on a stall door with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, that when he was ready to sell, he hoped it would go to somebody who understood what the place was and would not turn it into condominiums. The HOA rented it from him by the weekend, paid him a flat fee, and as far as I knew, never once thought about who actually held the deed. They did not own it. They never had. Brenda Voss had been throwing her galas in a barn she did not control. And she had built her social standing in that valley on a building that belonged to a man who still remembered a January snowstorm and the veterinarian who showed up in it. I did not say anything to Hannah that night, except that the barn was a fine old place, and that I had known the man who owned it for 30 years. But I lay awake in the dark doing arithmetic. The price a 40-acre parcel with a historic structure might fetch against what I had set aside across a careful life. And the next morning, I drove out to see Walt before I had fully decided what I was doing. He was on his porch with the same cup of coffee, looking smaller than the last time, but with the same clear eyes that had read horses better than most vets I trained beside. We talked about horses for an hour before I said anything about the barn, the way you do with a man like Walt, because to rush him would have been an insult to 30 years. Then I told him plainly that I was being run off my own land by the woman who rented his stable, that she had handed me citations for animals, my grandfather's deed protected, and that I had been thinking a man in my position could use a piece of property with some standing in the community. I asked him whether he had ever settled on what he wanted to do with Ridgeview. He looked at me a long while, the coffee cooling in his hand. He said he had been waiting for the right person to ask, and that he had about given up on one coming. He named a price that was fair, neither charity nor gouging, the price of a friend who also needed to eat. We shook hands on the porch the way men did when his barn was new. I told him I wanted it done quietly, recorded clean, no announcement, no sign on the road. He understood quiet better than anyone I ever knew. We agreed I would have my attorney draw the papers and we would close before the end of the month, and that he would keep a life estate on the cabin, so the only home he had ever known stayed his to the end. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where it would be easy to gloat. And I did not gloat. I did not call Brenda. I did not put up a sign. I went to the county recorder's office, the same counter where my grandfather's deed had been recorded 90 years before, where the wood of the counter had been worn smooth by 90 years of hands signing for land. On a Thursday morning in early September, I signed the papers that made 40 acres in the historic Ridgeview stable mine recorded by meets and bounds, witnessed and stamped. The clerk asked if I wanted it expedited. I said no, the regular way was fine. I only wanted it clean and dated and real. Walt signed beside me, his hand steadier than I expected, keeping his life estate on the cabin so the place stayed his to live in. We did not say much. We did not need to. Then I drove home and wrote it down. September 4th. Closed on Ridgeview. Walt kept a life estate on the cabin. The barn is ours. I told Hannah that evening, sitting on the back step while the horses grazed in the gold light coming sideways across the pasture. I told her we owned the white barn now, the one in the flyer, the prettiest barn in the county. She was quiet for a moment, working it out the way she worked out a horse that was favoring a leg. And then she looked at me with an expression I will keep the rest of my life, half disbelief and half something fiercer. "Grandpa," she said, "they're having the gala there in 3 weeks." I said I knew. She asked what we were going to do. I told her we were going to do nothing at all, that we were not going to call anyone or warn anyone or stop anything, and that we would let them come to us, in their own time, in front of their own people. She thought about that. Then, she said, "So they're going to throw their party in your barn?" I said that was exactly right. She almost smiled, the same way Owen had, and went in to start the feed. The fines kept coming through September. 18 citations. Now, then, 20, then 22. Brenda did not know what I owned. She drove past my gate with her vanity plate and her clipboard on the passenger seat, and I waved, and she thought she was winning, thought the old man at the dead end of Saddle Creek Road was finally close to breaking. Her lawyer sent a second lien threat, firmer than the first. I filed it behind the others. Owen Tate came by once more in that stretch, and I told him only that I had acquired a piece of property that might prove useful. And he gave me a long, careful look, and said he would keep that in mind, and asked nothing further, because he was the kind of officer who let facts arrive in their own order. I did not tell him which property. I wanted everything to land in sequence, in the open, in front of witnesses where no one could ever say, I had cooked it up or sprung a trap. A trap is a thing you hide. I was only declining to volunteer it. The thing about Brenda's scheme, the part I pieced together slowly across that summer and fall, was that it was never really about my horses. I started where I always start, with the public record. I drove to the county planning department on a Monday, the same kind of brick building where I had filed work for 30 years. And I asked the woman at the counter what applications were pending for the area around Saddle Creek Road. She pulled them without a second thought, because that is what public records are for. And she laid them on the counter, and I read them standing up, with my reading glasses pushed down my nose. Gerald Voss, Brenda's husband, had optioned a tract of land directly adjoining the Cottonwood Ridge subdivision. His plan, filed with the county where such things are public if you only know to look, was to expand the development into a second phase, a luxury equestrian community of all things, with bridle paths and a clubhouse and lots of price for people who wanted the idea of horses without the work of them. I stood at that counter and looked at the expansion map, and there in the middle of it, hatched and labeled as a parcel to be acquired, sat my 11 acres, my grandfather's 11 acres. Like a stone in a boot, Gerald needed me gone. The fines were not enforcement, they were eviction by attrition. Dressed up in HOA letterhead, and Brenda was the instrument. Because Brenda believed the costume she wore. I asked the clerk for copies of everything. She made them. 40 cents a page. I paid in exact change and drove home and filed them in the Cottonwood folder, which by then would no longer close flat. I learned the rest from a woman named Dana Schaffer, who sat on the HOA board and could not stomach what she was watching. She called me on a Sunday in late September, her voice low, the sound of a kitchen behind her. She told me she had seen the planning documents passed around at a closed board session, that she had heard Gerald himself invited as a guest, refer to my property as an acquisition target, and that she could not be part of running an old man off land his family had held for a century. She had grown up rural herself, she said, before she married into the subdivision life. And her own grandfather had lost a place to a road widening once, and she had promised herself she would never sit quiet while it happened to someone else. She said she had copies of the closed session minutes. She said she would testify if it ever came to that. I told her to save everything. Make a second copy. Keep one somewhere that was not her house, and tell no one. She said she already had. There are good people on bad boards. Dana was one of them. And I have thought since that the whole thing turned on a stranger's conscience as much as on any deed. The gala was set for the second Saturday in October. The week before it, the HOA's 24th citation arrived, and with it, a formal notice that the association would be placing a lien on my property and pursuing forced compliance through the county. Phil Renner's signature was at the bottom. I read it twice, filed it, and made one phone call to my attorney, asking her to prepare a single document and to be available the following Saturday afternoon. Then I called Walt and asked if he minded my attending the gala at my own barn. He laughed for the first time in a while and said he would not miss it. Saturday came clear and cool, pines dark on the western slope, the white barn lit up gold inside with strings of lights and round tables and a banner for the beautification fund. I parked among the luxury Saabs in a truck that had hauled hay that morning. Hannah came with me in a clean shirt, and Dana Schaffer was there, and Owen Tate, who I had asked to come in his own capacity as a witness and who came in uniform because a deputy is never quite off duty. I carried a manila folder. I had carried a manila folder into this fight in April, and Brenda had not looked at it then. I intended for her to look at it now. Brenda was at the center of the room in a magenta blazer and pearls, holding a glass of wine, telling a circle of homeowners about the vision for the community, the bridle paths and the property values and the unified aesthetic. She saw me come in and her face did something complicated. A flicker of confusion under the performance, because I did not belong in her picture of the evening. She crossed the floor, fast, heels loud on the old plank boards, her own foundation never laid. The boards Walt's father had nailed down by hand, and she said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "You are not welcome here. This is a private community event. I will have you removed." She turned toward the door and called for someone to call security, though there was no security, only a college kid checking tickets at a card table. I let the room go quiet. I did not raise my voice. I waited until the murmur dropped and the college kid froze with a ticket half torn, and then I opened the manila folder and laid 2 papers on the nearest white-clothed table, side by side, the way you lay out evidence so a person cannot pretend not to see it. The first was the deed to the Ridgeview parcel, recorded September 4th, meets and bounds, my name on it, witnessed and stamped by the county recorder. The second was the lease agreement the HOA had signed to use the stable for the evening, the lease that named the property owner as the party with the right of entry and the right of removal. "Brenda," I said, and my voice was as level as I could make it. The same voice I had used to tell owners hard news for 34 years. "This is my barn. I bought it last month. You're renting it from me tonight, and the lease you signed gives the owner the right to be present, so I'm present." She looked at the deed. She looked at the lease. She looked at the running horse weather vane she had printed on every flyer for 3 years, turning slow on the cupola above us, and I watched the thing she had built come apart behind her eyes quietly, the way a fence comes down when the last staple pulls. Owen Tate stepped forward, not toward me, toward the table, and looked at the documents the way a man looks at facts rather than feelings. And he said plainly for the room that the deed was properly recorded, that the lease terms were what they were, and that the gentleman was the lawful owner of the premises. Dana Schaefer stood up at her table, near the back, slowly, and did not sit back down. Walt Hendry, sitting near the door in the only chair in the place that fit him, lifted his coffee cup an inch off his knee in something like a salute. Nobody clapped. It was not that kind of moment. It was the quiet kind, the kind where 24 $50 citations and a lien threat and a fake badge and a year of a man waving from his gate all land at once on one side of a balance, and the other side holds one deed recorded in 1931 and one deed recorded 6 weeks before. $1,200 in fines she had tried to collect against $0 I had ever owed. One barn she had built her name on that had never once been hers. The numbers were not close. They were never meant to be close. I had not made them lopsided. She had. Every time she chose not to read the page in front of her. I did not ask her to leave. I told the room the gala could continue, that the beautification fund could keep its proceeds, that I had no quarrel with the homeowners who had bought tickets in good faith. Then I picked up my 2 papers, put them back in the folder, and walked out to my truck with Hannah, and we drove home to feed the horses, while the lights still burned in the barn behind us. What happened after happened, fast, the way these things do once the first fact is loose. Dana Schaefer brought her copies of the closed session minutes and the planning documents to the next open HOA meeting, stood up in front of her neighbors, and read them into the record. And the homeowners learned for the first time that their dues had been funding a campaign to clear land for Gerald Voss's private expansion, that the beautification fund and the citations and the talk of community standards had all been pointed at one old man's 11 acres. People who had paid their dues in good faith did not like learning they were the engine of someone else's land grab. The meeting, I am told, ran past midnight. The The county planning department, once the second phase application drew public scrutiny, pulled it for review and found that Gerald had filed survey data that overstated his control of the adjoining parcels. My 11 acres chief among them, listed as acquired when it was nothing of the kind. Filing a development application on land you do not control is not a small thing to a planning commission. The application was denied with prejudice. The luxury equestrian community was never built. No bridle paths, no clubhouse, no lots for people who wanted the idea of horses. Brenda resigned the presidency before the homeowners could gather the votes to remove her, and Phil Renner withdrew the lien action in a single one-line letter. Because there had never been a lien to file against a deed his client did not encumber and never had. The fines vanished the way smoke does. Not one of the 24 citations was ever enforced, because not one of them had ever rested on anything real. I had paid $0. I keep that number because it matters more than any other number in this whole account. A man can spend a year being told he owes something and owe nothing at all if he keeps his papers in order and refuses to be moved off his ground. Gerald lost the option money on the adjoining tract when the expansion died. A sum I heard was considerable, the kind of loss that follows a man to the next deal. The Vosses sold the white SUV with the vanity plate that winter, and the Rhine plate went with it. I heard they moved to a development nearer the city, the kind with no horses and no history and no old deeds to trip over, and I wished them no particular ill. I am not in the business of wishing people ill. The barn was the point, and the barn was mine, and a man who has what he came for has no use for spite. I leased Ridgeview to the county 4-H the following spring for $1 a year, and Hannah taught a class of kids there how to pick a hoof and read a horse's ears and tell when an animal was hurting before it ever limped. The barn that had charged $100 a ticket for people to stand in, it became a place where children learned to be gentle with something larger than themselves, which is closer to what Walt's father built it for. Walt came to watch from his porch up the hill in good weather until the end of his days, which came peacefully 2 years later in his own bed in the cabin he had kept. I buried a good client and a better friend on a clear morning with horses standing in the field below the grave, and I have not been to Ridgeview since without thinking of him lifting that coffee cup an inch off his knee. The last thing I want you to see is the back step where I told Hannah we owned the barn. She is grown now, with her own veterinary practice 3 counties over. The same trade her grandmother used to tease me was hereditary. When she comes home, we sit on that step in the gold light and watch June's foal, who is not a foal anymore, and is gray around the muzzle herself, graze the same ground my grandfather cleared with a team and a chain. Carol's name is on a stone at the edge of the pasture where she liked to stand at evening. The horses still stand where they have always stood, and nobody has sent me a letter on letterhead in years. So here is the lesson, plainly, because you came this far and you deserve it, spoken straight. If an association or a board or a man with a clipboard tells you that your land is functionally theirs, do not argue with them in the driveway, and do not pay a fine you do not owe just to make the letters stop. Go to the county recorder and pull your deed, the real one, the recorded one. Read it against the ground, corner to corner, and learn where your lines actually run. Because most people never have. And the people who would take your land are counting on that. Keep a folder, label it, and put every notice and photograph and letter into it the day it arrives, with the date in the frame, because the calm man with the records beats the loud man with the costume every single time. Walk your boundaries until you know them in the dark. Talk to your neighbors, all of them, because one of them may be a Dana Schaefer who cannot stomach what she sees and is only waiting for someone honest to tell it to. And when you find the thing they value most, the barn they rent, the access they need, the approval they require to do the thing they should not, you do not need to take it in anger, and you do not need to take it at all if you cannot. You only need to own what you can own. Quietly, keep your papers clean, and let the truth arrive in its own order. If you have a story like this one, a time the clipboard met the deed, leave it below. I read them. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one, because next week I'm telling you about a retired surveyor whose HOA painted a parking line straight through an easement his great-grandfather recorded, and how a single old plat map turned a towing company into the most expensive mistake that board ever made. Until then, keep your papers in order and keep your gate where you built it.